All right, folks, welcome to the course. This is the first chapter, and let's see what we need to travel through in this chapter. This is about threat environment. So, what exactly is a threat environment? Let's get started and see what the chapter tells us to do. Again, as I have said this in introduction before, what the book offers is a lot of material, and I really don't want to keep reading the whole book to you. My effort here would be to kind of supplement the book, so I encourage you to read the book, see what it has to offer, visit some of the links that are presented there, and I promise that's going to be a lot more fun than just listening to me. All right. So with that, let's get started here. So what are the learning objectives, right? The learning objectives are the follows. We're going to define what is a threat environment and why are we looking at threat environment. What does it mean, right? Then we're going to look at the basic security terminologies. Let's get used to it so we are all understanding what we're talking about. Describe the threats from employees and non-employees, right, or ex-employees. Describe the threat from malware writers. Describe what the traditional hackers are doing in their attacks, right, including their break-in process, how do they do the social engineering, denial of service attacks, and many more attacks that we're going to look at. And the chapter is to tell you or kind of convince you that the dominant attackers today are the criminals. So these are not your amateurs trying out their prowess in computers anymore. These are people that are trying to do actual harm, whether it's monetary harm, bodily harm, intellectual harm, and so forth, right? So we're going to look at the types of attack they make and the methods of cooperation. And finally, we're going to take a look at the distinction between cyber war and cyber terror. It's just that if you know the terms, you know what people are talking about when they use cyber war versus cyber terror. Right. So how does this all stitch together? Let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at how this all stitches together, right? So you have the threat environment, and everything that we are studying in chapter one is part of the threat environment. But as you can see at the bottom here, chapter three is about cryptography, then security networks in chapter four. Then we have access control, firewalls in chapter six, host hardening in chapter seven, application security or application hardening in chapter eight, and chapter nine is about data protection. Finally, in chapter 10, we're going to look at some incidents response. What we are going to look at chapter 2 are policies and planning that goes into cybersecurity, and that's important, right? We have a framework to work from when we talk about cybersecurity. It's not hit and trial at this point, fortunately, right? So let's take a look at the next um, slide here. So orientation. How is the book oriented? This book is about security defense. It is not about how to attack. All right. Defense is very complex, and sometimes, and this is what the second bullet says. The first chapter looks at what is out there as a threat, so we know what are we protecting against, right? Attackers and their attacks. So unless you understand the threats you face, you cannot prepare the defense, right? Um, and all subsequent chapters focus on defense. Now, a quick note here: you realize that you have a moving target, right? Um, your attack landscape keeps changing from day to day to day. And there are several sites. As we go through the course, I will be pointing out some of them to you, and you'll see that that's a landscape that keeps changing every day. The new attacks, new vulnerabilities are exposed, new attackers show up on the scene, new methods of break-ins, and you have to then move your defense accordingly, right? So it's a work cut out for both teams. As hard as the hackers are working on the other side of it, or attackers are working on the other side of it, you are working just as hard to defend yourself, right? Okay, what's next? So there's we just covered the we're going to cover the introduction and some terminologies, and then we're going to look at employees. How are they a threat, and as compared to ex-employees? What is a malware? What are hackers, and what are their attacks? Um, what is this is the criminal era, and how do we define that criminal era? Why were we calling this a criminal era, right? And then we're going to look at the competitor threats. Finally, we're going to end this with cyber war and cyber terror. What is the difference between the two? All right, so some basic security terminology. Now, if you've done the prerequisite course for this, you already know the some of these terms. So it's a little bit of repeat, but we are building on that knowledge. So this is going the next level deep, if you would. All right. So what is a threat environment? Threat environment consists of the type of attackers and the attacks that the company face. And companies, we are talking about enterprise security. We're not so much talking about individual security, right? Just keep that in mind. So the first thing that we talk about as security goal is our CIA, and CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So let's take a look at all three of these. And again, this is a revision for some of you, so I don't need to go into a gory detail of what this is, but it plays into everything that we are doing, right? So confidentiality means that people cannot read the sensitive information that is available, whether it's obfuscated or hidden from them, um, or they they are prevented from ever accessing that at all, and it is both at rest and in transit. In other words, when it's on your computer and when it's traveling across a network. Integrity means that attackers cannot change the information, um, or destroy the information. All right, so that means that information that you wanted or intended for somebody to take a look at is maintained, right? Whether it is on your computer or while it is traveling across the network, right? Um, or this is the important part, or at least if the information is changed, how do we make sure that we detect the change, and then how do we kind of mitigate that? That means how do we get the information back to what it was supposed to be, all right? Um, Availability. The last leg of CIA is availability. Availability means that when people who are authorized to use the information are not prevented from doing so. In other words, let's say when you have service interruptions, or you are um, not able to get to the data because of denial of service attacks. All those are cases where available data is not available to people who are supposed to be using it. All right, so some of the other basic security terminologies, compromises, there are successful attacks, also called incidents, also called breaches. So I want to kind of point out to you that you would often see that same um, word has various different ways it is specified, and there are minute differences, but for now let's just make sure that we understand that these are all successful attacks, which are the compromises, right? So compromises can be called incidents or breaches. All right, so now let's look at countermeasures. Countermeasures are measures that you take to thwart the attacks, right? Is again, here we go again. These are called safeguards, protections, and controls. So you can see that we kind of have different words of describing it. Now there are different types of countermeasures we can take. We can take preventative count. Oh, let me go back. We can take preventative countermeasures. Oh, come on, don't move away. Detective countermeasures or corrective countermeasures. Now, if you look at your text, and I'm not going to go through gory details on this, but it gives a great example um, with a lot of dedicated space to the Sony data breaches. Okay. The reason for doing that is it provides a very great, good example, a solid example of how a attack can take place first there is a vulnerability. The attackers take advantage of that vulnerability, and then they are able to successfully exploit that for to their gain, right? So without actually reading through this, I would highly encourage you to go and read this up in your textbook, right? um, there was a first attack which was dated 2011. Then May 1st, later on, they did a second attack. This time, um, it was a SQL injection attack, and we're going to take a look at a little bit of interesting parts of how SQL injection attack happens. And as a result, and then there was a third attack, which was it involved um, SonyPictures.com. So various different parts of Sony was getting attacked, and they really did not have a good plan of thwarting these attacks. So, what was the incentive behind this attack? Well, back then, the incentive for Lulzec, that was one of the um, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but several of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with cyber security, and they would have heard about Lulzec or Anonymous. Their main motivation for here was that they wanted to punish Sony for the DRM restrictions that they were imposing on somebody that actually were allowing games to be played. So they, like I said, they did this through a SQL injection attack. Now, this is one of the attacks that are now top 10 in an WASP list, and go through and I'll show you in subsequent lectures what is a WASP list. It is kind of, if you would, the most wanted list that you should actually take care of as far as a security profession goes. And SQL injection attack is one of the ones that you want to take care of. Very simple to do nowadays, but it was not so simple or not discovered. It's simple to do now, but it wasn't known by the time this was taking place, folks. So what happens in SQL injection? So here you see that there's a login screen that is presented, right? What happens in the login screen? You provide your um, username, you provide your password, and off you go, right? Well, when you do that, there's a SQL query that is formed, and you can see this. Select from users where username, boil2, and password, whatever, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. All right. So you are selecting from the table of users where username is this and password is this. Of course, if you provide an incorrect password here, it is not going to work, right? So, what do? You go ahead and create a very clever password, as you see over here. And this is the injection that is taking place. So what happened to the statement that you saw in the previous slide? It now became select from users where username is boil02 and password whatever, or 1 equals 1 minus minus. So this would make, let's just look at it very carefully. What will happen here? Well, this part of it, which says password whatever, is gonna be wrong, right? The password actually is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, but you just said or 1 equals 1, well, which is always true. So if this is true or this is true, let me in. Well, guess what? This is going to be always true, right? So that's why you are let in. All right. So here is um, here is a gotcha question for you. For those of you who are familiar with SQL, you can ask me what the heck is this minus minus thing doing here? Minus minus. I can't draw with this, but you're talking about these two minuses that sit right here. Well, the reason that these are there is to make anything else that is appended to it into a comment statement. If you know SQL, you would know that two minuses or minus minus makes that line read as a comment, whatever comes after that. So if within the program you're trying to add something else to it, maybe even to prevent any kind of um, SQL injection, you might add some other code, like for example, and something that is not visible um, to the external user. You actually negated that. And actually, if to be truthful, is not actually minus minus. It is minus minus followed by a space, and then any character. So it kind of almost looks like minus minus space minus. All right, because there's has to be a space between the minus minus and the next set of whatever it is, right? So anything that you append to it, it'll nullify that. So pretty clever, if you ask me. All right, so the attackers. They were, like I said, they were members of both Lulzec and Anonymous. So they're attackers. Well, they were both members of Lulzec and Anonymous groups, and they many of them were actually arrested and pleaded guilty. Hector Monsieur, he actually faced 122 years in prison, but was the key informant that kind of uh, got a lower sentence because he was actually pleading um, guilty and ratting everybody out, if you would. So the fallout from it. The fallout is important here. This was many years ago. It was shocking. Sony had to face a lot of lawsuits outside of any governmental fine, if you would. And the government of UK found that Sony was doing really bad things. So actually, they ended up fining Sony 395,000 because of their security measures were simply not good. What I didn't tell you is once you got in, you could actually download the password file from Sony, and that actually had the passwords for every user. They didn't even encrypt the password, which is, you can think of that as a terrible thing. And you will learn later that how you should not reuse the password, but back then that was a gold mine. Or even today, if you can get plain text password, you can actually try it out, right? So that opens up more security vulnerabilities elsewhere from Sony. So they had to face a lot of bad press and estimated loss of about 170 million. Let's keep going. So what are threats from employees and ex-employees? Well, employees and ex-employees are dangerous. Dangerous why? Well, they have the knowledge of the internal systems, right? They often have the permissions that you have already given them as part of their work to access various systems. Some of these may be even sensitive systems, right? They often know how to circumvent the detections that you have put in there. So they know, for example, that you have a WSA, you have a firewall, you have routers that are doing a certain level of testing. They know the kind of softwares you have deployed, how your password is being aged, etc., etc. So they know a lot, and they can actually be taken advantage of that, or avoiding detection. On a physical in a physical world, let's say they know the location of the cameras in the hallway, and they can easily avoid those to pull off their crime. So that's important. And the last one is definitely not the least important. Employees generally are trusted, right? You can't um, not trust employees because they are part of your workforce. Let's face it, 9 out of 10, or 1 out of like 99 out of 100, I should say. Uh, so let's face it, nine out of 10 or even 99 out of 100 employees are really good people, and you don't want to bother them. You want to trust them. They are part of your workforce. But remember, any person that actually has mal ideas is actually going to take a so you have to you should know that they would actually take advantage of it if they get an opportunity because of that trust, right? Uh, so what kind of threats that we're talking about? Well, employee sabotage, for example, they can sabotage the hardware, software, or data. They can plant time bombs or logic bombs on computers, and you can read a great example in your book about that. Employees can hack because hacking is intentionally accessing a computer resource without the authorization or in excess of authorization. So as you can see that there's no um, crime defined here. Just accessing a computer where you're not supposed to be, or a resource where you're not supposed to be, is hacking, right? If you try to, let's say, unlock a door to a cabinet, but you really didn't steal anything. The very fact that you unlocked a cabinet that you're not supposed to be unlocking, and you're trying to just gain access to it without telling anybody is hacking. So when we talk about hacking, typically talking about a computer resource here. So hacking is intentionally accessing a computer resource without authorization or in excess of the authorization given to you. Employee financial theft. Well, this is like misappropriation of assets, theft of money, theft of intellectual property, right? Trade secrets that can be stolen are all valuable. For example, Google's search algorithm or the famous Coca-Cola formula. These are trade secrets, right? If they are stolen, the company takes a massive loss because of it. Recently, Google won a lawsuit against uh, the person. All right, so next is employee extortion. Perpetrator tries to obtain money or other goods by threatening the company. And they threaten to take action. They threaten to do things that would harm the company, so the company is kind of obligated to pay the extortion money. Um, Not all of it is always exposed, um, and it comes to light in press, so we don't come to know about that, and that's a major portion of it. Sometimes the companies are involved in sensitive dealings or tasks, and the ex-employee can then threaten to expose the company's secrets if XYZ or certain things are not done for them, and that's an extortion. Sexual or racial harassments, for example, via email or displaying pornographic material. Internet abuse. So downloading pornography, which can lead to sexual harassment lawsuits and viruses. You would not believe the a number of viruses that are typically showing up because of downloading of pornography at workplace. Downloading pirated software. This is, believe it or not, last month this was one of the biggest um, vector or threat environment that was discovered. Um, it's a software that do not immediately infect your computer, but they would actually the pirated software with their software decryption key would install something that would then lay docile for, let's say, 6 months or 8 months before that actually wakes up and does something, which is a virus or a worm. So you would not be paying attention. You would not even know how it showed up, but it could have showed up when you downloaded and installed a pirated software. There was a hidden malware with that. We'll talk about what malwares are. Excessive personal use of internet at work. It's self-explanatory. Let's move on. So there could be loss or theft of computers or data media containing sensitive information if you're being careless, if you leave your sensitive information, whether it's electronic computers or data, um, at places where somebody else could get to it. Other internal attackers are, like, for example, contract workers, or let's not forget Edward Snowden was a contract worker, so he had access to several different things. Or workers in contracting companies that often get your data and they may be careless or not, or may end up hiring people that are not uh, working in your best interest. All right, let's look at malware. Definition: generic name for any evil software. So now we're going to look at some of the other definitions. For example, viruses. What are viruses? Programs that attach themselves to legitimate programs or the victim's machine. All right. They are spread today primarily by email, but there are other forms of getting it too. For example, through instant messaging, file transfer. You install some softwares that are not kosher. This is, I believe, this is from your text, but this is the um, virus source code for I Love You virus. And you can probably see right about here, all it's doing is changing the registry entries on your computer, and that's part of what is installing the bug on your system. Worms. Now, worms are full programs. They are not like virus, right? They are not being attached to something or to other programs. But like viruses, they can spread via email, instant messaging, and file transfers. All right. So one of the things that you got to keep in mind is that worms do direct propagation. That means worms can jump from one computer to another, and they are usually doing so by exploiting a vulnerability for a direct propagation, right? So they are exploiting something in the computer that have a vulnerability that is causing the worm to then replicate itself um, across machines. Direct propagation worms can spread extremely rapidly, as you can see how that can happen, because they do not have to wait for users' action. They can wake up and do their work and get busy. And you didn't even access the machines. They can do it at night. In fact, all the machines, let's say, which are on the same network, and then travel across the network to other routers and other computer systems very easily. So they can jump hosts. All right, so what are blended threads? Blended threads are malwares that propagate using various different ways, like, for example, like worms, viruses, compromised web pages, right? Um, what is a payload? Payload is a piece of code that do damage. So viruses and worms um, in themselves are not doing anything. They're actually just pieces of software that either are sitting in on your storage device, or they are loaded in your memory trying to do something, right? But it is the piece of code that actually is executing to do whatever uh, damage that it is supposed to do. For example, the software that is or in-memory program that is actually reading your keystrokes, or in-memory program that is actually sending out messages, pings on behalf of you to other computers. So these are malicious payloads that are designed to do heavy damage. All right. Non-mobile malware. Non-mobile malware are placed on the user's computer through one of a growing number of attack techniques, right? They are placed on computers by hackers, not surprising. They're placed there by viruses or worm as part of their payload. And the victim can be enticed to download the program from an FTP site. So these are the ways you will get that payload there. And mobile code executed on a web page can download the non-mobile malware. Trojan horses. Now, Trojan horses are very interesting. Now, these are programs that replace an existing system file, taking its name, right? One of the earliest one that I can remember uh, used to be the Paint program that came with Microsoft Windows, and somebody had replaced that with a malformed Paint program. So every time you open the Paint program, it would actually do damage to your PC. Or if you are scanning for viruses, because Paint is part of the Microsoft's package, nobody actually bothered to look carefully to see if it is one of the uh, malwares that is installed instead of actual Paint program. Remote access Trojans are Trojans that are remotely, they allow the hackers to remotely control the victim's PC. Okay, and downloaders are small Trojan horses that actually install the larger or the next Trojan horse. All right. So, for example, you could go to dark web and say, "I got this Trojan horse that I want to deploy, but how would you get started?" So you can actually buy Trojan horses that are already sitting on victims' computers. You can buy them by, let's say, 100,000, and those Trojan horses can then push your malware or your Trojan horses to the same computers or the next set of computers. Okay, so some of the Trojan horses are spywares, for example, then programs that are kind of gathering information about you without you knowing it. Cookies that store too much sensitive information about you. Keystroke loggers. Every time you're using your keystroke, it can reverse engineer and find out exactly what was entered on what site. Password stealing spyware. They can actually pop up windows that you don't know are not from your um, real software. They're actually trying to steal your passwords. And then finally, data mining spyware. These are people think that these are innocent pieces of software, but they are actually collecting some interesting data about you. For example, what are your habits? Are the places you're looking up? Where are you going for vacation? How many days you're going to be gone, etc., etc. Let's cover a couple more slides and then we can take a short break. All right. So now, what are rootkits? Rootkits take control of a super user account. By default, you don't run things as root, but these are kits that actually take control and become a super user on your computer. And at a super user level, they can override, for example, system files, and they can do things that only system administrators can do. For example, they can actually disable your antivirus software. So now you have no protection, right? It's like somebody got into your home and started opening up the windows and doors without actually you knowing about it, right? Or somebody got in and cut the wire to your alarm system successfully, so now anybody can get in. They can hide themselves from file system detection. So if you're just scanning the files, you would not find them. They are at a system level where your scanners don't want to go look. All right. It can hide malware from detection because if it's hidden amongst the system files, it's not looked up, or at least wasn't looked up. Now all of these are covered. Extremely difficult to detect because ordinary antivirus programs find very few rootkits. It's important to know that. Mobile code. So, what is a mobile code? Mobile code is a code that is on a web page. You can open it up on a mobile device, for example. And code is executed automatically when the page is downloaded, right? So, these are, for example, JavaScript or Microsoft ActiveX controls that are supposed to run a piece of software right on your browser, right? So they can do a fairly good amount of damage. All you did was visit a page, right? But this can actually access and run stuff on your computer. It can do damage if your computer has any vulnerabilities, right? That's important. And finally, Social engineering in malware. What is social engineering? Social engineering is an attempt to trick the user into doing something that goes against the security policy. For example, uh, spam. You are all familiar with what spams are. Phishing. That means I'm actually phishing for information from you. Whether I flash a bank page, pretend to be um, your bank reaching out to you for overdraft fees and say, click here if you want to avoid overdraft. Spear phishing, when you are trying to do phishing, but you are um, going for somebody or individual that are powerful, right? So, for example, if somebody comes to know you are, let's say, a system administrator, so you would be target for spear phishing. Also, when you do this kind of phishing to like the C-suite people, it's called whaling. That means you are reaching out for, let's say, CEOs or CIS or CISOs, the chief information security officers, and so forth. That's called whaling. And finally, hoaxes. When everybody's familiar with hoaxes such as Nigerian prince, or just to name one. These are hoaxes. So you can be hoaxes might be like inviting you on a free cruise ship, tickets for two, and if you provide me these information, and that might include everything from social security number to the copies of your passport. Those are hoaxes that will pull you in. All right. All right. Now the next one is hackers and attacks, and we are halfway through, folks. So I want to give you guys a break, stretch your legs. This is getting a little longer. Just grab yourself a cup of coffee, and we will meet on the second part of this lecture. Thanks. See you soon.